Welcome back to Arkansas, where we try to make sense of the issues affecting Arkansans. The Arkansas Constitution guarantees us the right to use petitions to get new laws on the ballot and then vote on them. But you've probably heard about a petition being thrown out at some point, possibly for reasons that seem ridiculous. You may have also heard that it keeps getting harder to get petitions on the ballot in the first place. But how did we get here? Is it getting harder? And if so, why? And what can we do about it? Let's get started. While most Arkansas laws are made by the state legislature, Amendment 7 to the Arkansas Constitution gives citizens like you a way to go around the legislature, the Initiatives and Referenda process, or INR. Initiatives can make a new law or amend the Arkansas Constitution, and referenda can overturn a recently passed law. Based only on Amendment 7, here's how you do it. You start by writing a petition, which has to include a popular name, a ballot title describing what the petition would do, and the actual legal text to add or change. Next, you need to gather supporting signatures from a minimum number of Arkansas voters. The total number is a percentage of how many people voted in the last election for governor, 10 for constitutional amendments, 8 for regular laws, and 6 for referenda. You also need half of that percentage in at least 15 counties. Presumably, you can't collect all those signatures yourself, so you'll need people to gather signatures, called canvassers. They can be volunteers or paid, but either way they have to witness each signature personally. Those signatures have to be turned in before a deadline, 4 months before the election for an initiative, or 90 days after the legislative session ends for a referendum. And before then, you also have to pay a statewide newspaper to print the whole text of your petition. When you turn the petition in, the Secretary of State checks your paperwork and counts your signatures. If everything's right, your petition is certified. If there's any problems, you get 30 days to fix them, called the cure period. And if you have any legal disagreements, the case is fast-tracked to the Arkansas Supreme Court. If your petition meets the requirements and makes it through any legal challenges, it goes on the statewide ballot in the next even-numbered year. Then, it's up to the voters to decide. Your petition only needs a simple majority to succeed. The right to INR was first added to the Arkansas Constitution in 1910, a time when many voters believed the Arkansas legislature was corrupt, controlled by wealthy donors, and not responsive to the needs of the people. So INR is supposed to be a check on the legislature, a way for Arkansas voters to override them and pass laws they don't care about, are afraid to support, or actively oppose, like limits on their power. The legislature would generally prefer to not be checked, but Amendment 7 bans them from passing any laws interfering with circulating petitions or that restrict the rights of INR. However, they are allowed to pass laws that facilitate INR and required to pass laws that prohibit and penalize forgery. So in 1911, they passed an Enabling Act, a set of laws restating the rules of INR and adding the required details, like standard forms for petitions. This is that legislation, 12 pages long, relatively simple to read and understand. Over the following decades, just about every one of those laws was challenged. The Arkansas Supreme Court, following the text of Amendment 7, repeatedly asked the same question: is the law a facilitation or a restriction? Facilitations can stay, but restrictions are forbidden. The court was also responsible for resolving legal challenges to petitions, and the most common challenges were about ballot titles. When you sign a petition, it has to have its name, title, and full text attached. But if it makes it to the ballot, voters don't see all the legalese text, only the popular name and ballot title. So there were, and still are, lots of lawsuits over whether those tell the truth about what the text would do. So the Arkansas Supreme Court developed a test for challenged ballot titles. While they don't have to describe everything the petition would do, they do have to give a general idea, and must not be misleading or biased. Originally, petitions had to gather all their signatures with no idea whether their ballot title would survive a legal challenge. To help with this, the legislature made their first major change to INR in 1943, creating early review. Early review allowed the Attorney General to check petitions before they gathered signatures and suggest ballot title corrections when needed. Early review was initially optional, but later became a requirement, and when that was challenged, the court ruled that early review would help more petitions pass. So, it's a facilitation, not a restriction. But all the fuss around ballot titles was part of a bigger picture. In basically all other areas, petitions were given the benefit of the doubt. The Enabling Act says, forms given herein are not mandatory, and if substantially followed in any petition, it shall be sufficient, disregarding clerical and merely technical errors. The courts took the same attitude, allowing petitions with incorrect dates, words, forms, as long as the ballot title was truthful and the full text was presented to everyone who signed. They even ruled that if a petition had enough signatures before review, but didn't after invalid ones were thrown out, it could use the 30-day cure period to gather more. The general attitude was, it's better to trust voters to decide than to take away their choice over technical errors. That attitude lasted as late as the 1980s. In 1984, a group wrote a petition for an anti-abortion amendment. The petition gathered enough signatures and was certified, but was thrown out by the court, who said the term unborn child in the title was politically biased. In 1986, they tried again with different language, and made it to the ballot, but lost by just 500 votes. So in '88, they tried a third time. But when they turned in their signatures, many of the forms only included a zip code, not a physical address or voting district as required. The Secretary of State let the group use the 30-day cure period to gather more signatures, and eventually also counted the incorrect ones, as long as they belonged to registered voters. So, the petition ended up on the ballot, and that November, voters passed Amendment 68, still part of the Arkansas Constitution today, despite the massive paperwork error. But the 1980s also brought a massive influx of cash to petition campaigns. The Anti-Abortion Amendment Group had raised $90,000 in 1986, about $250,000 adjusted for 2024. And in 1988, Governor Bill Clinton helped fundraise for 2 citizens' amendments, including a successful one requiring lobbyists in the Arkansas legislature to register with the state and provide monthly financial disclosures. Whether out of a genuine desire for transparency or in reaction to petitions they didn't like, or a bit of both, the legislature passed the second major change to INR in 1989, adding a new set of financial transparency rules. Any group spending over a minimum amount to campaign for or against a petition was required to register with the state and provide monthly disclosures. The rules definitely added some complications to INR, but they also made the process more public, and the penalty for breaking them was a fine or jail time, not disqualification of your petition. So that's where things stood in Arkansas through the 80s. The rules for INR were a bit more complicated, but the basics were largely unchanged, and petitions were given the benefit of the doubt so long as they got enough valid signatures and their ballot titles were not misleading. But the process being relatively easy made it attractive for people with lots of money willing to fund petitions that would benefit them. In 1990, a petition legalizing lotteries made it to the ballot, but was disqualified in court for a misleading ballot title. Specifically, the title did not mention the amendment would create new paid government positions for 4 specific amendment supporters, one of whom was dead. And just days before it was disqualified, Arkansas State Police announced an investigation into allegations the campaign had forged as many as 1/4 of its signatures, either faking them, not witnessing them, or lying about canvassers. It was the start of a trend. Each year, more money fueled more petitions, some with built-in monopolies, and there were more allegations of forgery. The Arkansas legislature responded with a handful of small but important new INR laws, including making it a crime for canvassers, not just signers, to lie on a petition. The Secretary of State's office also began publishing an INR handbook each election year, turning the ever more complicated laws into clear instructions. But there was also a surge in money spent against petitions, fueling more legal challenges, which all had to happen in the short window between the Secretary of State's review and the election. So more and more frequently, initiatives were thrown out just weeks before voting. The legislature tried to fix this with laws allowing ballot title challenges right after early review, but it didn't do much. No one wanted to spend money on challenging a petition when it might still fail based on signatures. It's not clear if the fraud prevention rules had their intended effect either, but the legislature seemed to think so. Between 2000 and 2011, they made only a few more small changes to the INR rules. For the nearly 100 years of INR's existence, Democrats had controlled both houses of the Arkansas legislature. They'd stayed in power through the 2000s by remaining relatively centrist and supporting populist positions, including the right to ballot initiatives. They continued that support even as voters passed initiatives aimed at decreasing their power, like the 1992 Term Limits Amendment, and initiatives Democrats generally were opposed to, like the 2004 ban on gay marriage. But in 2010, the midterm after President Obama's first election, a national red wave saw Republicans make huge gains in multiple states, including Arkansas. In 2012, they maintained that momentum, taking majorities in both the state House and the Senate. During that same election, there were some major petition shenanigans, most clearly embodied by Issue 3, another casino amendment with a monopoly built in. Issue 3 had its title approved by the Attorney General and began gathering signatures. But when those signatures were turned in, the Attorney General said he had changed his mind and advised the Secretary of State not to certify the petition. So it was disqualified, and the petitioners filed a lawsuit. While waiting for a ruling, the group was allowed a cure period, and then the Secretary of State reviewed their signatures. Over 95,000 were validated, well above the requirement. But that's only after disqualifying even more, about 105,000. Plenty of petitions had lost 5 or 10% of their signatures to review, but losing over half was unheard of. Yet somehow, the same year, another citizen's petition failed with an even larger percentage of its votes thrown out, and came under investigation for faking signatures. The casino amendment's disqualification was upheld by the court in October, but ballots for the election had already been printed, and, wildly, the same thing happened to another amendment that year. So Arkansas voters saw 2 amendments on their ballots for which none of their votes would count. 2012 spotlighted a few problems. 1. Petitioners had no reason to trust early review if the AG could just change their mind later. 2. Groups who thought they would fall short on their initial signature count might be incentivized to fake just enough signatures to qualify for a cure period. And 3. People were now regularly using paid canvassing companies to get signatures. And, at least in 2012, those companies had a high rate of disqualification. The following year, the new legislative majority used those disqualifications to justify a complete overhaul of the INR rules. That included some smaller changes, like increasing the requirements for financial disclosures. It also included a proposed constitutional amendment to immediately disqualify any petition that fell below 75% of its required state or county signature numbers during review. That amendment was approved by voters and still applies today. But the biggest change by far was Act 1413, a 19-page long bill which makes small changes to nearly every part of INR laws, and much bigger changes in 2 areas: paid canvassers and how signatures are counted. Before Act 1413, the rules for paid and unpaid canvassers were the same. They had to sign each signature sheet, swearing they had witnessed each signature, and that as far as they knew, everyone who signed was a registered voter. And that was it. But under Act 1413, the person running the petition campaign, called the sponsor, has to give each paid canvasser a copy of the INR handbook and explain the rules of canvassing. The paid canvasser has to give the sponsor their name, address, photo, and sworn statements that they have received the handbook, had the rules explained, and have never violated a list of disqualifying crimes. The sponsor then has to send a list of all their paid canvassers to the Secretary of State, and they have to do that again every time there's a new paid canvasser before that canvasser gathers any signatures. At the end of the campaign, when the sponsor turns in signatures, they have to include a final list of all paid canvassers and a sworn statement that the sponsor gave each one a handbook and explained the rules to them. Act 1413 also changed what happens when signatures are turned in. Previously, the Secretary of State's office would do an initial count of all the signatures before disqualifying any. If the initial count met 100% of the state and county requirements, the petition was accepted. But Act 1413 made certain disqualification checks happen first, including violations of the new paid canvasser rules, which could disqualify an entire page of signatures or even all signatures collected by that canvasser. Those errors could not be cured, and the signatures would be subtracted before the initial count, meaning they could cause a petition to never be accepted in the first place. This is a huge change. Before this, the main check for signature fraud was to actually look at signatures. But Act 1413 assumes that bad paperwork is enough of an indicator for fraud that entire petition pages should be thrown out without ever checking a single signature. Most modern petition campaigns use some combination of paid and volunteer canvassers, so most campaigns run the risk of losing signatures and only finding out after it's too late to fix them. Act 1413 passed in March of 2013, but was put on hold barring court review, which didn't finish until 2015. The Arkansas Supreme Court allowed most of it to remain law, including all the bits we listed. They did so based on Amendment 7 requiring the legislature to make laws prohibiting and penalizing perjury, forgery, and all other felonies or fraudulent practices. They called Act 1413's requirements a minimal burden, and said the required information assures the state that the sponsor knows who their canvassers are, how to contact them, and that nothing calls into question their ability to interact with the public. But of the 7 justices, 3 disagreed, arguing in a dissenting opinion that all of Act 1413 should have been overturned, not because of any single provision, but because, quote, the cumulative result of the extensive changes to the initiative and referendum process is to deter Arkansans from exercising their fundamental rights under Amendment 7. Unquote. The decision to uphold Act 1413 was massive and signaled to the legislature that they could pass more INR restrictions in the name of fraud prevention. Literally 2 days later, they passed an act requiring sponsors to pay for a state background check on each paid canvasser before they gather signatures. And when turning in all their signatures, the sponsor had to include a statement saying those checks had been passed. 2016 was the first election when petitions had to follow the rules of Act 1413. 4 petitions turned in signatures: a malpractice lawsuit cap, a casino amendment with a monopoly built in, and 2 medical marijuana initiatives. They were all approved for the ballot and all challenged in court. 26 days before the election, the court disqualified the lawsuit cap for an insufficient ballot title, and the casino amendment for conflicting with federal law. The same day, they ruled one of the marijuana initiatives could stay on the ballot, but the other one got complicated and became the first real test of Act 1413. The campaign had started with mostly volunteer canvassers, but promised to pay some of them if it raised enough funds, so some went from volunteer to paid mid-campaign, while others were listed as paid but never compensated, and the campaign, by its own admission, did not do a great job of keeping up with their paperwork. But Act 1413 does not have a built-in way to go from volunteer to paid, and it also leaves no room for bad paperwork. So on review, the court threw out over 12,000 verified signatures for paid canvasser errors, including obtaining background checks after they'd collected signatures or not at all, declaring paid canvassers to the state after they'd collected signatures or not at all, and paid canvassers listing a P.O. box, business address, or nothing in the space where they were supposed to put their current residential address. The court had appointed a special master to the case, who recommended most of the signatures should still count, based on the bit from the Enabling Act about disregarding clerical and merely technical errors. But the court went out of their way to say he was wrong, declaring, quote, substantial compliance cannot be used as a substitute for compliance with the statute, unquote. Put another way, you have to follow the exact words of Act 1413, and trying your best will not excuse any errors. That decision left the petition under its required number of signatures, so the whole thing was disqualified. It's worth reiterating, all of the signatures on the petition had already been checked and validated, so a petition which had passed a check for signature fraud was disqualified retroactively for rules meant to prevent signature fraud. What's more, the court didn't deliver that decision until October 27th, after early voting had started, so some folks had already made decisions based on choosing between 2 medical marijuana initiatives. Those 2 marijuana initiatives had been strongly opposed by Republicans in the legislature and party officials like Governor Hutchinson, former head of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency. The governor spoke out against the petitions frequently, including at a press conference with the Arkansas Surgeon General, who also appeared in ads against the petitions, and the governor's Political Action Committee, ASAPAC, donated $10,000 to the group opposing them. But the remaining marijuana initiative did pass, and it's a constitutional amendment, so the legislature is only supposed to enable it, not restrict it. But many of the laws they passed in 2017 were accused of intentionally making it harder to implement. Eventually, 24 of those were overturned for interfering with the amendment. The legislature also found time to make INR just a bit more difficult with another new requirement: signature cards. Each paid canvasser has to fill one out, and the sponsor has to turn them all in when filing their signatures. But the legislature weren't the only ones unhappy about 2016. So was Attorney General Leslie Rutledge. She claimed that by throwing out the ballot title she approved for the lawsuit cap, the court had set an unreasonable standard.
Unfortunately, over the last couple of years, the Arkansas Supreme Court has muddied the water as to what is clear in a ballot title.
So, when petitions started rolling in for 2018, she rejected them. All of them. Counting originals and rewrites, the AG rejected 70 different petition drafts. Eventually, the state Supreme Court ordered her to stop blocking petitions, and she finally certified 4 with just 6 weeks left to gather signatures. 3 were approved for the ballot: a minimum wage increase, a casino amendment, and a term limits amendment. All of them were, of course, challenged in court. For the term limits amendment, the court disqualified nearly 15,000 signatures for violations of Act 1413's paid canvasser rules, including 2,000 from 2 canvassers who waited too long after getting background checks to make their sworn statements, 3,000 from canvassers who were declared a week late in part because of an accidentally password-protected email attachment, and 4,300 for writing their permanent address on petitions instead of the address where they were staying while collecting signatures. That last group was caught, in part, because they tried to fix their mistake. The Secretary of State had validated nearly 94,000 signatures, but the disqualification left the petition at about 79,000. 6,000 or so shy of its requirements. So the whole petition was disqualified. Meanwhile, the casino amendment and the minimum wage increase overcame their legal challenges, made it to the ballot, and passed. Like medical marijuana, the minimum wage increase had also been opposed by many of Arkansas's elected officials, including Governor Hutchinson and Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin.
Griffin, an avid opponent of Issue 5 before it passed, also says he's concerned right now that businesses will not be able to afford the increase.
Not only did it pass, but it outperformed those officials with voters. But while the medical marijuana initiative had been an amendment, the minimum wage increase was an initiated act. That meant the legislature had more leeway in what they could do to change or limit it. After it passed, Griffin worked with the legislature to carve out exceptions.
I think the legislature, there's been some talk that there may be ways to exempt really small businesses that can't absorb it as well.
Meanwhile, despite the previous court order, Attorney General Rutledge had gone back to rejecting petition drafts. She'd said no to a recreational marijuana petition 30 times. Before the court could step in again, she worked with the legislature to craft Act 376, which wrote the AG out of early review entirely, moving it to the Secretary of State and turning it into a rubber stamp, only confirming you'd turned in the paperwork. So petitions would get no official indication if their title was correct until after turning in signatures, the exact thing early review was made to prevent. What's more, the legislature gave final certification of ballot titles to the State Board of Election Commissioners, whose members are mostly appointed by the legislature. But even more consequential would have been the constitutional amendment the legislature sent to voters. HJR 1008 would have rewritten essential parts of the INR rules, increasing the number of minimum signature counties from 15 to 45, setting signature turn-in 10 months before the election instead of 4, setting a deadline for when lawsuits against petitions could be filed, and eliminating the cure period entirely. But voters utterly rejected it in 2020. That same year, 3 petitions turned in signatures, and they all ran into the same problem. That 2015 act requiring a sworn statement that paid canvassers had passed a background check. But a background check doesn't come with a pass or fail grade, just a list of offenses. And neither the legislation nor that year's handbook came with a clarification on what passed meant. So one of the petitions didn't include the statement, while the other 2 confirmed the checks were obtained, but didn't use the word pass. The Secretary of State rejected all paid canvasser signatures, and the court agreed, saying that regardless of the lack of clarity, the law required the word pass. That decision left the petitions under their required numbers and disqualified. So over 97,000 signatures on each of the 3 petitions were never checked for lack of the word pass. However, the next year, the court ruled that the pass law was actually impossible because it required getting a federal background check from state police, who can't do that. So the legislature replaced that law with Act 951, which creates a list of 17 offenses that disqualify someone from acting as a paid canvasser. That includes things like felonies and violent crimes, but also lesser offenses like trespassing and simple theft. Before each paid canvasser gathers any signatures, the sponsor has to pay for a background check it for the 17 offenses, and turn in a sworn statement that none of them showed up, along with the updated paid canvassers list. And the sponsor has to swear it again for all paid canvassers when turning in signatures. Act 951 also makes it illegal to hire canvassers who don't live in Arkansas, and outlaws paying canvassers based on the number of signatures they've gathered. The legislature also tried to send voters yet another initiative-limiting amendment, requiring initiatives which make the ballot to receive 60% of votes to pass instead of a simple majority. Just like 2 years before, voters rejected the amendment. That same election, 2022, a complicated recreational marijuana amendment got its rubber stamp early review and turned in enough signatures, but the State Board of Election Commissioners refused to certify its title. The sponsors filed a lawsuit and won, though they later lost at the ballot. But the court ruled that almost all of the changes A.G. Rutledge had pushed for were unconstitutional and had to be undone. So, in 2023, the legislature moved final title review back to the Secretary of State and early review back to the Attorney General. That position now belonged to former Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin, taking over for Leslie Rutledge, who became lieutenant governor. But the legislature also got up to something much more controversial. For 2 elections in a row, they had sent amendments to voters trying to increase the basic requirements for INR. Both times, voters said no. So in 2023, they passed Act 236, a regular act, not an amendment, which increases the necessary counties where petitions have to hit their minimums from the constitutionally set 15 up to 50. 2/3 of the whole state.
Some Republican state lawmakers are making it harder for citizens to create ballot initiatives. In Arkansas, voters have used those initiatives to legalize medical marijuana, raise the minimum wage, and more.
As early as 2019, some news outlets began speculating Arkansas was part of a larger trend. In multiple Republican majority states, voters had used citizens' initiatives to pass policies like medical marijuana, minimum wage increases, and expanded Medicaid coverage. And after they did, the Republican legislatures tried to make initiatives harder by increasing requirements for signature totals, county minimums, and voter percentages. Arkansas legislators justified their attempted changes like this.
The Arkansas Constitution is a very sacred document and should be held in high esteem among all of us. It was not meant to be easy to change or to amend.
It needs to be difficult, and it needs to be difficult on purpose.
But this right here is a way for us to help protect our state constitution, which is being just muddled up by interest groups.
Right now in our state constitution, we've got drugs and casinos and gambling. Do you think our forefathers would be happy with the fact that we've got marijuana and casinos in our constitution? Do you think that is what they intended it to be?
We have easy ballot access laws. So you might say, oh, well, I can get this before the voters pretty easily. And then you'd say, well, Arkansas is a small rural state with inexpensive media markets. So I can just put a couple of $1 million into it to temporarily convince people, at least 50% plus one, that my idea is a great idea.
We are one of the easiest targets for these groups that come in from out of state to bring us marijuana and gambling and a lot of things that most Arkansans do not support.
It's worth pointing out that since Act 1413 took effect in 2015, amendments about casinos and marijuana were the only citizens' amendments not disqualified by the new paid canvasser rules. Meaning, if the legislative majority could somehow retroactively uncertify all the marijuana and gambling amendments, then there would have been 0 citizen amendments on the ballot during that time. Many of those same legislators argued marijuana and gambling should have been initiated acts instead of amendments, like the minimum wage increases. But initiated acts can be changed or overturned with a 2/3 vote in the legislature. an easy thing for the existing supermajority. While some of the paid canvasser rule changes had been more bipartisan, the 2019 and 2021 attempts to make initiatives harder passed almost exclusively along party lines. Republicans in favor, Democrats against. And the same was true for Act 236 in 2023. The Republican Party of Arkansas had taken a clear stance that it should be harder to pass initiatives. The legislator who proposed Act 236 pointed to Amendment 7 requiring minimum signatures
from, quote, at least 15 counties. So the Constitution sets a floor, but it does not set a ceiling.
However, Amendment 7 also says no petition shall be held invalid if it shall contain a greater number of signatures than required herein. So a court challenge seems likely. But that same year, an Arkansas Supreme Court justice had died. And while seats on the court are normally filled by nonpartisan elections, midterm vacancies are filled by the governor. Newly elected Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders appointed Cody Highland, who at the time was serving as chairman of the Republican Party of Arkansas.
Highland also served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Arkansas from 2017 until 2020. After that, he worked on the governor's election campaign.
In 2023, the legislature also passed the LEARNS Act, a signature piece of legislation for Governor Sanders. Almost immediately, a group drafted a referendum to put the LEARNS Act on hold, pending a vote on the 2024 ballot. They submitted a petition to A.G. Griffin, but he rejected both the first and second drafts, citing minor errors like font size and also claiming the ballot title did not summarize all aspects of the 144-page LEARNS Act. Finally, the group submitted the longest petition draft in Arkansas history, and the AG approved. Having a few drafts rejected is nothing unusual for initiatives. The problem is referenda have to turn in signatures within 90 days of the legislative session ending, no matter how long early review takes. The first draft was rejected April 24th, the final approved June 5th, and the signature deadline was the end of July. So the two rejections effectively eliminated over a third of the signature gathering time. Griffin was accused of intentionally slow-rolling the petitions and felt the need to make a YouTube response video. In the remaining 2 months, without using paid canvassers, and while having to meet the new 50-county minimum, the petition collected 53,444 signatures, falling only 978 short. The LEARNS referendum marked a shift in the way Arkansas public officials talk about ballot initiatives. Former Governor Hutchinson had used his position to try and sway opinions on marijuana and the minimum wage, but the focus of his criticism had been the policies, not the people behind the petitions. In contrast, Governor Sanders said the folks behind the LEARNS referendum were
trying to play political games with our kids' future
and called them self-serving partisan extremists. And she maintained that same tone as petitions were submitted for the 2024 ballot, looking to amend the LEARNS Act, expand medical marijuana, and loosen the state's abortion restrictions. Some of Sanders' closest political allies formed ballot question committees to oppose those petitions. Her former campaign manager became the head of Stronger Arkansas, and her former communications director started Arkansans for Students and Educators. As of August, those groups had raised over $1.5 million, including $25,000 from Huck PAC, run by the governor's father, $500,000 from Jim Walton of Walmart fame, $250,000 from Pennsylvania billionaire Jeffrey Yass, and over $200,000 in in-kind donations from the national group Americans for Prosperity. They used that money to send mailers, run ads, and pay in-person petition blockers for decline to sign campaigns. The petition to change LEARNS failed to collect enough signatures, but the abortion and marijuana amendments turned theirs in, as did a petition to undo parts of the previous casino amendment. The abortion amendment filed over 100,000 signatures, but they did not include the required statement that their paid canvassers had been given the handbook and had the rules explained to them. The group said someone in the Secretary of State's office had told them the statement was not necessary, but the Secretary disqualified the entire petition. The group filed suit, hoping to at least keep signatures from paid canvassers who'd made those declarations as they were added. But the court said it did not matter what someone in the Secretary of State's office may have said, because the burden of determining what the law requires falls on the filer, not office staff. And the court echoed the same things it had said years before to the groups who hadn't used the word pass. Namely, missing any required final paperwork for paid canvassers disqualifies all paid canvasser signatures. And Thanks to Act 1413, that disqualification happens before those can count towards a cure period. Over 14,000 signatures were thrown out, leaving the petition about 3,000 shy of the requirements. So the whole thing was disqualified. When the Secretary of State had first disqualified the petition, the governor took to social media to say the failure proved the petition's supporters were immoral and incompetent. Attorney General Griffin joined in, making another YouTube response video and saying the group had no one to blame but themselves. After the court's decision, Griffin said that the group had failed to follow the law passed in 2013, that's Act 1413, which everyone else had followed. But perhaps more telling is the message from the governor. Proud I helped build the first conservative Supreme Court majority in the history of Arkansas, and today that court upheld the rule of law. As of filming, the 2 other 2024 petitions are still being challenged in court. We started with a question. Is it getting harder for petitions to reach the ballot in Arkansas? The answer is yes. Between 1920 and 2012, the fundamentals of initiatives and referenda were basically the same. The biggest additions were early review, financial disclosure, and some clarifying court decisions. But broadly speaking, before 2013, your petition's validity was based on signatures. Your paperwork could be fixed, and the basic principle was, when in doubt, let the voters decide. But the passage of Act 1413 changed everything. Its paid canvasser rules mean potentially authentic signatures are regularly discarded for paperwork errors, and it restructured the signature counting process so those errors cannot be fixed but can disqualify an entire petition. More recent changes exacerbate those same issues, and so does the state Supreme Court, valuing the specific text of any law claiming to prevent fraud, but never testing that claim. Meanwhile, the state's new majority party has adopted the position that petitions should be more difficult, and because they're unlikely to lose power anytime soon, they can act with no fear of voter backlash. The legislature undermines petitions that have passed and asks voters to make it harder to pass anymore. The AG and Secretary of State's subjective decisions contribute to a petition's success or failure, and the governor uses official channels to deride and delegitimize not just petitions, but the people behind them, and to boast about influence over the process. While the Republican Party of Arkansas has made INR a partisan issue, it does not have to be that way. Historically, Arkansas ballot initiatives were never the property of just one party or ideology. They were used to create police pensions and ban teaching evolution, to create libraries and limit abortions, to raise the minimum wage, to ban gay marriage, and most of all, they were used to put limits on the legislature. So you should be suspicious when any elected official tries to make our right to INR a political issue. INR is not about Democrats versus Republicans. It's about our ability to limit the legislature versus a legislature that hates being limited. And by making INR harder, the legislature has helped maintain their control. Of the 5 initiatives disqualified over paid canvasser rules before 2023, 3 of them would have made it harder for legislators to hold on to power. During that same time period, a petition that turned in its signatures was more likely to be disqualified than to reach voters, and despite that, a majority of legislators still claimed the process was too easy, and after years of failing to convince voters, used Act 236 of 2023 to raise the basic INR requirements even higher. The default is no longer let the voters decide, but instead, your legislature knows what's best for you. So let's fix it. Obviously, we can't overcome a decade plus of legislation, court decisions, and political influence with any one action. But when the state Supreme Court ruled on Act 1413, the dissent called it death by 1,000 cuts, and we can cut back. One option is to politely but firmly reprimand our legislators and tell them to do better. You can find out who represents you and how to contact their office by going to senate.arkansas.gov or arkansashouse.org. Call or email them and say you want the initiative and referenda rules fixed to favor counting every real signature instead of paperwork pettiness, and that you want the counting requirements back where the Constitution sets them. But if your legislator is unresponsive, or you feel sick at the thought of contacting them, there are plenty of other small steps you can take. For one, when you see people out gathering signatures for a petition, go find out what it is. Talk to the canvassers, read the petition, ask follow-up questions, and if you don't absolutely hate it, go ahead and sign. Worst case scenario, if you find out later you don't like it, vote against it in November. Better to help create that option for all Arkansans. And if you really like what it says, maybe volunteer to help gather signatures. It's a super easy thing to do, and every signature you get as a volunteer is one that can't be thrown out over paid canvasser rules. If you're seeing petitions around, that probably means it's an election year, so you should check who's running for office and what they say about INR. Pay attention to officials who have a big effect on petitions, like the Secretary of State and the Attorney General. They're up for election every midterm. Even if you support the majority party, consider voting across party lines for one or both of those positions. When it comes to amendments referred by the legislature, given how often they've tried to sneak things by voters, educate yourself on what they've sent over, and maybe default to voting against them. And for citizens' initiatives and referenda, use resources like the U of A voter education materials, or the ballot issue videos on this channel to educate yourself. But also, be skeptical of what anyone on the internet tells you, even me. Read the petitions for yourself. Talk to your friends and family about them. Assume everything you hear comes with a bit of bias and a touch of truth. And however you do it, make sure you know what's on the ballot before you're in the voting booth. But most of all, don't lose hope. This can all feel overwhelming, like politics itself is designed to promise you the opportunity to get involved and make change, only to make the process so awful you don't want to participate. But legislators are only so invested in making it harder because it can still make a difference, because we can still make a difference. Every petition is a reminder to the legislature who they work for, and it seems they keep needing to be reminded. So find one worth signing. Find one worth voting for. And if you can't, you have the power to write it yourself. Our Constitution says so.